of the city, where the cobblestone streets whispered with the secrets of the past, a figure moved with purpose. The man, Mr. Jenkins, was a creature of habit. Every morning at precisely 6:45, he would leave his apartment, the third floor of a dusty brownstone, and make his way to the local bakery for a cup of black coffee and a crusty baguette. His eyes, a piercing blue that had seen more than their share of heartbreak, scanned the familiar faces of the neighborhood as he walked. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee grew stronger with each step, a comforting symphony that greeted him as he pushed open the door. But today was different. An eerie silence hung in the air, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The usual chatter of early risers and the distant hum of traffic were muted, replaced by a heavy, foreboding quietude. Mr. Jenkins felt a cold shiver run down his spine, a sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the dreary weather that had settled over the town like a damp shroud. Rain pattered against the windows of the bakery, creating a rhythmic melody that seemed to echo the erratic beating of his heart. As he waited for his order, Mr. Jenkins noticed a folded piece of paper on the counter. It was damp and slightly crumpled, as if it had been outside in the rain. He picked it up, intending to toss it in the bin, but something about it intrigued him. It was addressed to the one who sees, an unusual moniker that immediately piqued his curiosity. With trembling hands, he unfolded the note. The handwriting was spidery and chaotic, the letters almost indecipherable. But as he read, his eyes widened in horror. It was a confession. The note detailed a series of gruesome murders that had plagued the city for months. Each one more twisted and depraved than the last. They had left the police baffled and the community in a state of fear. Mr. Jenkins knew the details well. He had read about them in the newspaper with a morbid fascination that he had never fully understood. But as he read the killer's taunts and justifications, a chilling realization began to dawn on him. He was the only person who knew about this note, the only one who could piece together the puzzle it presented. He had stumbled upon something that could change everything. With the note clutched in his hand, Mr. Jenkins left the bakery, the warmth and safety of the place now feeling suffocating. The rain had intensified, turning the cobblestone streets into a labyrinth of shimmering puddles. The world outside had transformed into a canvas of greys, the buildings seemingly melting into the fog that rolled in from the river. Each step took him closer to a decision he never wanted to make. He could either ignore the note and go about his day, or he could delve into the darkness that had taken root in his quiet little neighborhood. The weight of the decision bore down on him as he turned the corner onto his street. His apartment was in sight, a beacon of normalcy in a world suddenly gone mad. But as he approached, he saw a shadowy figure lingering in the alleyway beside his building. His heart hammered in his chest as the figure turned to face him, revealing a face twisted into a manic grin. It was the killer, and he had a glint in his eye that spoke of an unquenchable thirst for chaos. The air grew thick with tension, and Mr. Jenkins knew that he had been seen. The killer took a step towards him, and he could see the rainwater dripping from the edge of his hat, creating a macabre pattern on the cobblestone. His mind raced, searching for an escape, a way to warn someone before it was too late. But the words remained lodged in his throat, a silent scream that echoed through the deserted alleyway. The killer spoke, his voice a chilling blend of charm and menace. "You've been looking for me, haven't you?" He took another step closer, and Mr. Jenkins felt his knees threaten to buckle. "You think you can stop me? You're just a pawn in my grand design." Mr. Jenkins's eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help him. He spotted a forgotten umbrella, its fabric faded and tattered, leaning against the alley wall. In a desperate move, he lunged for it, swinging it with all his might as the killer advanced. The metal tip connected with the man's chest, sending him reeling backward with a grunt. The killer's grin faltered, and for a moment, Mr. Jenkins saw something akin to surprise in his eyes. With a newfound determination, Mr. Jenkins turned and ran. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the sound of his own footsteps. The rain grew colder, stinging his face and mixing with the sweat that beaded on his forehead. He didn't dare look back, fearful that the killer was right behind him, ready to pounce at any second. His lungs burned, begging for air as he sprinted down the street, the paper confession still clutched tightly in his hand. The fog grew thicker, wrapping around him like a damp embrace, obscuring everything but the blur of buildings as he passed. The streets grew narrower, the lights dimmer, until it felt as though he was running through a nightmare of his own making. The cobblestone gave way to slick pavement, and the comforting scent of baking bread was replaced by the sharp tang of fear. He knew he had to get to the police station to tell them what he had found, but the path ahead grew murkier with each step. The rain intensified, forming a curtain around him, and Mr. Jenkins felt the first tendrils of doubt creeping in. What if the killer had seen where he lived? What if he had already told someone else about the note? What if he was leading the monster straight to his door? His mind raced with horrifying scenarios, each more vivid than the last. He stumbled, the umbrella slipping from his grasp, and he fell to his knees with a painful thud. Panting, he forced himself to stand, the rain soaking his clothes and plastering his hair to his skull. The alleyways grew more treacherous, littered with debris and shadowy figures that could either be the killer or a trick of the light. The streets grew quieter, the only sounds the drumming of rain and his own frantic breathing. His hand trembled as he reached into his pocket for his phone, his fingers fumbling to dial the emergency number. As the line connected, a chilling laugh echoed through the alley, sending a shiver down his spine. The killer had found him. He spun around, the phone slipping from his grasp and shattering on the wet ground. The figure emerged from the fog, his eyes gleaming with a malicious excitement that sent a bolt of terror through Mr. Jenkins. He knew he had only one chance to survive. To bring the nightmare to an end, he had to fight back. The killer stalked closer, his movements fluid and predatory. Mr. Jenkins searched the ground for anything that could serve as a weapon, his eyes settling on a broken piece of pipe, rusted and sharp. He grabbed it with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed, raising it in front of him like a shield. The killer paused, his grin widening. "You're more interesting than I thought," he sneered. Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath, the rain now a torrent around him. He could feel the cold steel in his hand, the weight of it grounding him in the chaos. "Leave me alone," he managed to choke out, his voice shaking with fear and rage. The killer's smile grew, as if savoring the moment before the hunt. Flesh was sickeningly wet, and the killer's grin was replaced with a snarl of pain. He stumbled back, giving Mr. Jenkins enough space to make a break for it. He didn't look back as he sprinted, the rain blurring his vision and the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out the world. The police station loomed in the distance, a beacon of hope amidst the fog. His legs felt like lead, but he pushed himself forward, driven by the knowledge that he had to warn someone, to stop the madness that had consumed his once peaceful city. The killer's footsteps grew fainter behind him, But Mr. Jenkins didn't dare slow down. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, turning his fear into a white-hot determination to survive. As he reached the station, the heavy wooden door felt like a mountain to push open. The warmth and safety of the interior beckoned, a stark contrast to the cold, damp hell of the streets. He stumbled inside, gasping for air, the pipe still clutched tightly in his hand. The officers at the front desk looked up in shock, their eyes widening at the sight of the disheveled man, covered in mud and rainwater. "He's here," Mr. Jenkins panted, his voice hoarse. "The killer! He's right behind me!" But as the officers rushed to the door, peering into the swirling fog, there was no sign of the shadowy figure. The alley was empty, as if the killer had vanished into the very fabric of the night. The room grew silent, the only sound the persistent drip of water from Mr. Jenkins's soaked clothes. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, their doubt clear. But Mr. Jenkins knew the truth. He had seen the madness up close, had felt the chilling breath of the monster that had been taunting them all, and with the crumpled confession still in his pocket, he had the power to bring the killer to justice. He took a deep breath and began to recount his harrowing tale, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. The officers listened intently, their expressions shifting from disbelief to concern as he spoke of the note and his encounter with the murderer. He handed over the paper, watching as their eyes scanned the twisted words, the realization of what they had in their possession slowly sinking in. One of them called for backup, the urgency in his voice cutting through the quiet. The station buzzed to life, a hive of activity that Mr. Jenkins found both comforting and overwhelming. As the minutes ticked by, the officers began to treat him less like a suspect and more like a witness. They took his statement, offered him a chair, and a hot cup of coffee that did little to warm his bones. He watched as they analyzed the note, their brows furrowed with concentration. The killer had made a mistake, and Mr. Jenkins had unwittingly become the linchpin in the case that had stumped the best of them. The lead detective, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached him. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her voice softer than he had expected. "We need to get you into a safe place. We can't risk the killer finding you again." He nodded, his hand still trembling around the coffee cup. He knew what that meant. He was now part of the story, a player in a deadly game he had only observed from the sidelines. As they escorted him to a secure location, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The killer was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his moment to strike. The rain had subsided to a gentle patter, almost apologetic for the chaos it had brought. But Mr. Jenkins knew that the storm was far from over. The killer had made it personal, and now there was no going back to his quiet, orderly life. The safe house was a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, its walls thick with secrets and the smell of stale cigarettes. The officers installed him in a small, sparse room with a single bed and a bolted-shut window. They assured him that he would be safe here, that they would catch the killer before he could come for him again. But Mr. Jenkins knew that the game had changed. The hunted had become the hunted, and the only way to survive was to become the predator. The night stretched out before him, a yawning abyss of uncertainty. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. He had always been a spectator in the grand tapestry of life, but now he was a thread that had been plucked out and was being woven back in with brutal force. He knew he had to act, to do something to bring the killer to justice. But what could one man do against a monster that had eluded an entire city? With a newfound sense of resolve, Mr. Jenkins pushed himself off the bed and began to pace the room. He had read enough detective novels to know that clues could be hidden anywhere. And if the killer had made contact with him, it meant that he had underestimated him. He was not just a pawn in this twisted game, he was a player with a role to play. As he thought, his eyes fell on the crumpled note again. The words seemed to pulse with malice, as if the very ink was alive with the killer's sick intent. He studied it, looking for something, anything, that could lead them to the monster's lair. And then he saw it, a tiny detail that had been overlooked in the initial frenzy. A symbol, drawn hastily in the corner, that matched the tattoo he had, glimpsed on the killer's hand. Mr. Jenkins felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. He wasn't just a pawn, he was a piece of the puzzle, a key that could unlock the killer's identity. He grabbed a pen and began to scribble notes, his mind racing. With theories and connections, the room grew warm with his fervor, the chilling dampness of the alleyways forgotten. He was going to find the killer, and he was going to stop him. And as he worked through the night, the storm outside mirrored the tempest within him, a battle of wits and wills that would determine the fate of the city and all those who called it home. The next morning, Mr. Jenkins presented his findings to the detective. She studied the note, her expression unreadable. This could be something, she admitted, but it could also be a wild goose chase. But Mr. Jenkins was insistent. The tattoo was a sign, a taunt, a clue left just for him. With her reluctant agreement, they set out into the city, following a trail that grew colder with each passing minute. They visited tattoo parlors, showing the symbol to artists and patrons alike, but no one recognized it. The killer was clever, leaving no clear path to follow. Days turned into weeks, and the case grew colder. The city's fear evolved into a numb acceptance, the headlines about the murders fading into the background of daily life. But Mr. Jenkins couldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the killer's grin, heard the echo of his laughter in the alley. It consumed him, driving him to the brink of obsession. He lost track of his job, his friends, and even the comforting routine that had once defined his life. The line between hunter and hunted blurred, until he wasn't sure which he was anymore. One evening, as he sat in the safe house, staring at the peeling wallpaper and contemplating his next move, his phone rang. The display showed an unknown number, but something about the way it vibrated in his hand told him it was important. He answered, his heart racing. The voice on the other end was a whisper, a hiss of satisfaction that sent shivers down his spine. "You're getting closer," the killer said, and the line went dead. Mr. Jenkins stared at the phone, his hand shaking. He knew the killer was watching, playing with him like a cat with a mouse. But he also knew that the call was a mistake, a clue. He had the killer's attention, and that was all he needed. He called the detective, his voice a mix of excitement and terror. "I know how to find him," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He's going to make his next move soon." The detective listened, skepticism warring with hope in her eyes. "We need more than that," she said. But Mr. Jenkins was already formulating a plan. He knew the killer's MO, the patterns of his madness. and with the tattoo as a starting point, he was going to turn the tables. They would set a trap using Mr. Jenkins' bait. It was risky, but it was the only way to end the nightmare that had gripped the city for too long. The stakeout was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Mr. Jenkins sat in a car, his heart hammering in his chest, while the detective and her team watched from nearby rooftops. The night was still. The only sounds the distant wail of a siren and the occasional splash of a raindrop on the pavement. Hours ticked by, each one a silent scream in his mind. And then, as the first light of dawn began to peek through the clouds, they saw him, the killer, emerging from the shadows, drawn by the promise of his favorite prey. Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the metal of the pipe cold and reassuring in his hand. The killer's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed into a grin. He had been expecting this, had been waiting for the moment when the pawn would try to become the queen. But Mr. Jenkins was no longer just a man with a note. He was a force driven by anger, by fear, and by a burning need to protect. The killer approached, his movements deliberate and confident. But Mr. Jenkins was ready. As the killer lunged, he swung the pipe with a strength born of desperation. The impact was sickening, the sound of bone cracking beneath the metal. The killer stumbled, and Mr. Jenkins didn't hesitate. He swung again and again until the grin was wiped from the killer's face, until the monster that had haunted the city was nothing more than a broken man on the ground. The detective rushed over, her gun drawn, but it was clear the threat had been neutralized. The city could breathe again, the fog of fear lifting as the sun began to rise. Mr. Jenkins dropped the pipe, his hands trembling, and stared down at the killer's prone form. It was over. The monster had been caught, the nightmare brought to an end. In the aftermath, the city celebrated his bravery. The quiet man who had brought a killer to justice was now a local hero. But Mr. Jenkins felt no joy, only a deep, bone-weary relief. He had seen the face of evil up close, had felt its breath on his skin, and it had changed him. The quaint corner of the city, once a bastion of comfort, now held a darker edge, the shadows seeming to whisper of the chaos that had once reigned. The days that followed were a blur of interviews and commendations, his life picked apart and examined under a microscope. The detective was true to her word, and the killer's identity was revealed. A man named Charles Castor, a name that would become synonymous with terror. But the price of victory was high, and Mr. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost a piece of himself in the process. The quiet mornings at the bakery, the simple pleasure of a cup of black coffee and a baguette, were forever tainted by the memory of that fateful day. Finally, the storm of attention began to die down, and Mr. Jenkins was allowed to return to his apartment. The brownstone looked the same, but everything felt different. The cobblestone streets, once a comfort, now held whispers of the chase that had unfolded. He stepped inside, the familiar creaks of the floorboards echoing through the empty rooms. The silence was deafening, a stark reminder of the life he had left behind. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Jenkins tried to piece together the remnants of his old life. He went back to work, to his friends, to the routines that had once brought him comfort. But the shadows had followed him home, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the killer's grin. The nights were the worst, plagued by nightmares of the alley, the laughter, the rain. He knew he couldn't go back to the way things were before. Not truly. The city had moved on, but he remained trapped in the grip of the horror he had faced. Detective checked in on him regularly, her concern etched on her usually stoic features. She spoke of counseling, of finding a way to heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon his soul. But Mr. Jenkins knew that some scars didn't fade with time. He had become a part of the very fabric of the city's dark history, a silent sentinel of the nightmare that had almost consumed them all. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, the silence broken only by the ticking of a clock, Mr. Jenkins made a decision. He couldn't live in fear, couldn't let the killer's legacy define him. He stood up, his resolve firm, and went to his bookshelf. There, hidden behind the dusty tomes, was the note, the crumpled confession that had started it all. He took it in his hand, feeling the weight of its significance, and made his way to the fireplace. With trembling hands, he struck a match and watched the flame dance to life. He held the paper to the fire, the ink curling and blackening as the flames consumed it. As the confession burned, so too did the last vestiges of the nightmare. He had faced the monster and won, and now it was time to move on. The fire cast flickering shadows on the wall, and for the first time in months, Mr. Jenkins felt a sense of peace begin to settle over him. The rain had stopped, the fog cleared, and the world was bathed in a soft golden light. The city was healing, and so was he. He knew that the scars would remain, a constant reminder of the battle he had fought. But he also knew that he had the strength to carry on, to face whatever new challenges life had in store for him. And as the last embers of the confession turned to ash, Mr. Jenkins stepped into the dawn of a new day, ready to write the next chapter of his story. The detective's visits grew less frequent as the months passed, her own battles calling her back to the streets. But she had left him with a gift, a newfound sense of purpose. He had seen the darkest side of humanity and had come out the other, and forever changed but not broken. He took up running, pounding the pavement each morning as the sun rose, pushing his body to its limits as a way to exorcise the demons that still haunted his dreams. One morning, as he jogged through the now familiar streets, he noticed a young woman standing in the alley where he had encountered Custer. She was trembling, a lost look in her eyes that mirrored his own from that fateful day. Without thinking, he approached her, offering a gentle smile. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than he had heard it in a long time. Her eyes lit up with hope, and she clutched at his arm. I think I've seen something," she stammered. "Something terrible." Mr. Jenkins felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Had another monster emerged from the shadows to claim the city as its playground? "What did you see?" he asked, his heart racing. The young woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. A man," she whispered. "He was hurting someone. I didn't know what to do." Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had a choice to make. He could ignore her, go back to his life, and pretend that the darkness didn't exist. Or he could be the hero the city needed once more. The decision was easy. He took her hand and led her to the nearest police station, his stride firm, his resolve unshaken. Together, they recounted her story, and Mr. Jenkins watched as the officers sprang into action, the same determination in their eyes that had fueled his own hunt for Custer. He knew that this was just the beginning of another journey, one that would test him in ways he couldn't imagine, but he was ready. He had faced the worst of what the world had to offer and had come out the other side. He was no longer just Mr. Jenkins, the man with the note. He was the guardian of the streets, the one who dared to stare into the abyss and say, "No more." The detective listened to the young woman's account, nodding solemnly. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting Mr. Jenkins with a newfound respect. "We'll handle this." But Mr. Jenkins knew that he couldn't just walk away. He had been given a second chance, a new purpose. And so he offered his help, his unique insight into the mind of a killer. The detective hesitated, but something in his eyes told her that he was not a man to be underestimated. As they set out to find the new threat, Mr. Jenkins felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the thrill of the hunt. But this time, it was different. This time, he was not just a pawn in a twisted game. He was a protector, a force for good. As the shadows grew longer and the streets grew quieter, he knew that he had found his place in the world, standing firm against the encroaching darkness, a beacon of hope in a city that had seen too much fear. They followed the girl's description, the echo of her sobs a grim reminder of what was at stake. The alleyways grew more sinister, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked trash, and the faint hint of something more sinister. The detective's hand hovered near her gun, her eyes scanning the shadows with the practiced ease of a seasoned hunter. But Mr. Jenkins had been down this path before, and he knew that the real monsters didn't always hide in the dark. As they turned a corner, they found themselves face to face with the new killer, a man whose eyes were cold and dead as the night around them. The young woman gasped, her hand tightening around Mr. Jenkins' arm. But he didn't flinch. He had seen this look before, had stared into the abyss, and lived to tell the tale. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Let her go and we can talk." The killer's smile was a twisted mockery of Castor's, but the malice behind it was all too real. "I don't think so," he sneered, his grip on the girl tightening. "You're just like them, always poking your nose where it doesn't belong." But Mr. Jenkins knew that he wasn't like the others. He had faced the darkness and come out the other side, and he wasn't about to let this monster win. The detective moved in, her gun drawn, but Mr. Jenkins held up a hand to stop her. He knew that force was not always the answer. Sometimes had to get into the mind of the killer, understand their twisted logic. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the man's. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice low and even. The killer's smile grew wider, his eyes glinting with a madness that was all too familiar. "Because I can," he replied, his voice a chilling whisper. Mr. Jenkins felt a cold rage building within him, a determination to end this cycle of violence. He took another step, the detective's eyes on him, ready to act if needed. "Let her go," he said firmly. "This doesn't have to end like this." The killer's smile faltered, and for a moment, Mr. Jenkins saw a flicker of doubt. And then, with a sudden shocking speed, the man released the girl and bolted down the alley. The detective took off after him, but Mr. Jenkins remained, watching as the girl crumpled to the ground, sobbing. He knelt beside her, his heart heavy with the weight of his new role. He knew that the chase would continue, that there would always be more monsters waiting in the shadows, but he also knew that he had made a difference, that he had saved a life, and as he helped her to her feet, the sun breaking through the clouds, he felt the beginnings of a new chapter in his life, one where he didn't just observe the world, but actively shaped it, fighting for the light in the face of the ever-present dark. The detective returned, breathless, to report that the killer had escaped. But Mr. Jenkins wasn't deterred. He knew that it was only a matter of time before they found him. "We'll get him," he said, his voice filled with a newfound steel. "We can't let this go on." The next few days were a blur of leads and dead ends. The city once again on edge as the news of the new killer spread. But Mr. Jenkins and the detective worked tirelessly, piecing together a portrait of the man they were hunting. And with each step they took, Mr. Jenkins felt the ghosts of the past begin to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. One evening, as they sat in the detective's office, surrounded by maps and files, Mr. Jenkins had a revelation. "The tattoo," he murmured, his eyes lighting up. "The pattern. It's not random. It's a map." The detective looked at him, her eyes widening with understanding. "The crime scenes," she said, her voice hushed. "They're all connected." They worked through the night, tracing the pattern of the tattoo through the streets of the city, following a trail of blood and pain that led them to a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the echoes of the killer's laughter seemingly trapped within its walls. They knew that they had found the lair, the place where the monster had been orchestrating his reign of terror. With the SWAT team in position, Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath and nodded to the detective. "Let's end this," he said, his voice firm, and together they stepped into the lion's den, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The door creaked open, revealing a scene of chaos and madness. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings and photographs of the killer's victims, their eyes staring out at them, begging for justice. The floor was sticky with a substance that made Mr. Jenkins's stomach turn. The killer was nowhere to be seen, but his presence was palpable, a living, breathing entity that filled the room with dread. They moved through the shadows, their flashlights casting eerie patterns on the walls, and then, in the far corner, they found him, crouched over his latest victim. His eyes flicked up, meeting Mr. Jenkins with a wild, feral glee. "You've come to join me," he cackled. But Mr. Jenkins knew better. He had faced the darkness before and had emerged stronger for it. "No," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I've come to stop you." The killer lunged, but Mr. Jenkins was ready. With the detective at his side, they brought the monster to justice, ending another chapter in the city's dark history. In the aftermath, Mr. Jenkins was hailed as a hero once more, but he knew that the battle was never truly over, that the shadows would always hold secrets waiting to be uncovered. And so, as the sun set on another day, he donned his running shoes and took to the streets, eyes sharp and senses honed, ready to face whatever the night had in store. The city was his now, not just a place to live, but a responsibility to protect. And with each step he took, each heartbeat that echoed through the quiet streets, he knew that he was not alone. The detective was his partner, her belief in him unshakable. And together, they would continue to stand against the darkness, ensuring that the nightmares of the past would never again threaten the innocent. The rain had stopped, the fog lifted, and Mr. Jenkins had become something more than a man with a note. He was the guardian of the city, the one who dared to stare into the abyss and say, "Not in my town." The warehouse was a grim testament to the depths of human depravity. But Mr. Jenkins felt a strange kinship with the space. It was a battleground, much like the alley had been. Only this time, The monster had not escaped. This time, he had faced the horror and emerged victorious. The detective's hand was firm on his shoulder, her eyes filled with a newfound respect. "We make a good team," she said, her voice low. Mr. Jenkins nodded, the weight of their shared victory heavy on his shoulders. In the weeks that followed, the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. The news of the killer's capture spread like wildfire, and Mr. Jenkins found himself the subject of whispers and stares. But he didn't revel in the attention. Instead, he used his newfound status to advocate for the victims, to ensure that their voices were heard and that their families could find closure. He had been a bystander in their lives once, but now he was their champion, fighting for justice in a world that had failed them. But as the days grew longer and the nights less haunted, Mr. Jenkins felt the grip of his nightmares begin to loosen. The shadows no longer held the same terror for him, and he could once again find peace in the simple things. The scent of baking bread wafting from the bakery, the comforting patter of rain on the windowsill, the quiet ticking of the clock that had marked the moments of his greatest fear. He had faced the worst of humanity, but in doing so, he had found the best of himself. And as he sat in his apartment, the sun rising outside, he knew that his story was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more monsters to slay, but he was ready. The city was his to protect, and he would not rest until every corner was free from the shadow of the predators that lurked within. The detective had become a friend, her no-nonsense demeanor softened by their shared ordeal. They met regularly, discussing the cases that still haunted the city, sharing their insights and theories. Mr. Jenkins had found a new purpose in helping her, his keen eye for detail and understanding of the criminal mind, invaluable in piecing together the puzzles that others could not. They were an unlikely duo, the meticulous baker and the seasoned detective, but together they formed a bond that was unshakable. One evening, as they pored over a cold case file, the phone on the detective's desk rang shrilly, breaking the silence. She answered it with a curt greeting, her expression shifting from boredom to urgency. "We've got another one," she said, her voice tight with tension. Mr. Jenkins felt his stomach drop. The nightmare was not over. The city had a new monster to fear. They rushed to the scene, the air thick with the scent of rain and fear. The body was laid out in a gruesome tableau, a macabre message from the killer that seemed to scream at them from the shadows. Mr. Jenkins felt his heart race, the echoes of Castor's taunts still ringing in his ears. But this was different. The patterns were not the same. The motives obscured by a twisted logic that was foreign to him. This was a new kind of horror, one that threatened to consume them both. The detective turned to him, her eyes haunted. "We need to catch this one," she said, her voice low, "before it's too late." He nodded, his hand tightening around the handle of the pipe that had become his symbol of strength. Together, they would navigate the treacherous waters of the city's underbelly, hunting for the new killer that had emerged to claim their nights. The investigation was a maze of dead ends and false leads. The killer always one step ahead. But Mr. Jenkins refused to give up. He knew the streets like the lines on his own palm, and he used that knowledge to guide them closer to the truth. The city watched with bated breath as the body count grew, the pressure on them both mounting with each passing day. But amidst the chaos, he found a strange comfort in the pursuit, in the knowledge that he was not just a victim, but a force to be reckoned with, and so the dance continued. The detective and Mr. Jenkins moving through the city like ghosts haunting the places where evil dwelled. They became a legend, a whispered rumor that gave hope to the terrified and sent chills down the spines of the wicked. With each step they took, the net grew tighter around the new killer. Their determination, a living, breathing entity that could not be denied. The night of the final confrontation was as cold and unforgiving as the monster they sought. The wind howled through the streets, carrying with it the promise of a storm to come. They had traced the killer to a deserted park, the swing swaying eerily in the moonlight. The detective checked her gun, her eyes never leaving Mr. Jenkins' face. "We can do this," she said, her voice firm. He nodded, the weight of his pipe a comforting presence in his hand. They moved through the darkness, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, and then they saw him, a silhouette of malice that sent a shiver down Mr. Jenkins's spine. The killer turned to face them, his eyes gleaming with a madness that was all too familiar. But this time, Mr. Jenkins was not alone. The battle was fierce, the sound of the pipe connecting with bone echoing through the night. The detective's gun was a steady presence, her shots a declaration of war against the shadows. And when it was over, when the monster lay at their feet, Mr. Jenkins felt the first true sense of peace he had known in months. The city was safe, and he had found his place within it. In the weeks that followed, the detective and Mr. Jenkins became a formidable team. Their names whispered in the same breath. They continued to patrol the streets, a beacon of hope in the night. And though the shadows never truly disappeared, they knew that together they could face whatever darkness the city had to offer. The story of the baker who had dared to stare into the abyss and emerge a hero became a legend, one that inspired others to stand up and fight back. One rainy evening, as they sat in their favorite coffee shop, Mr. Jenkins looked up from the newspaper article detailing their latest victory and met the detective's gaze. "What's next?" he asked, his eyes reflecting the flames of a burning determination. She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Rest," she said, placing a hand on his. "You've earned it." But rest was not in Mr. Jenkins' nature. The city was his, and he would not abandon it. So, when the detective received a tip about a string of burglaries, he insisted on joining her. The chase led them through the maze of alleyways, the rain a symphony of drops that masked their footsteps. They cornered the thief in an abandoned garage, the smell of oil and rust thick in the air. The young man, no older than a teenager, was trembling with fear, his eyes wide with the realization that he had been caught. But Mr. Jenkins saw something else in them, something that made his heart ache. The same desperation, the same need for control that had driven Custer. He stepped forward, the pipe at his side, and offered the boy a chance. "We can help," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to do this." The boy looked at him, then at the detective, and slowly the tremors in his hands stilled. He nodded, the beginnings of a tear tracing a path down his cheek. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll tell you everything." The detective's eyes met Mr. Jenkins's in the dim light, a silent understanding passing between them. The battle against the new killer had been won, but the war against the city's darkness was far from over. They had a new mission now, one that went beyond catching monsters. They would become the guardians of the lost, the voice for the voiceless, and the hand that offered salvation to those who had stumbled into the shadows. The city had changed them, had forged them into something more than they had ever been before. And as they stood in that damp, cold garage, Mr. Jenkins knew that he had found not just a purpose, but a family. Together, they would face the night, their lights piercing the gloom to show that no one was ever truly alone in the dark. The detective called in their findings, and the boy was taken into custody. His future uncertain, but no longer destined for the abyss. As they stepped out into the rain, Mr. Jenkins took a deep breath. The scent of the city streets now a mix of wet earth and the promise of a new dawn. They walked side by side, their footsteps echoing through the alley, leaving behind a trail of hope. Where once there had been only fear, the rain had washed the city clean, and in its place, a new order was born, one where the monsters had no place to hide. The days that followed saw Mr. Jenkins and the detective delve deeper into the lives of the forgotten, those who had slipped through the cracks of society. They uncovered a web of pain and desperation, a breeding ground for the kind of rage that could spawn a killer. They worked tirelessly to mend these fissures, their hearts heavy with the weight of the lives they had failed to save and the knowledge that it was never truly over. One evening, as they sat in Mr. Jenkins' apartment, the quiet broken only by the ticking of the clock, the detective spoke of her past, of the cases that had haunted her, the faces that still visited her in her dreams. Mr. Jenkins listened, his eyes filled with empathy. He knew that she too had her demons to face, and in that moment their bond grew stronger, forged in the fires of shared pain and a shared desire to make a difference. The phone rang again, the shrill sound piercing the stillness. The detective's hand hovered over the receiver, and Mr. Jenkins felt his heart rate spike. Another monster had reared its head, another life shattered by the whims of fate. But this time, they were ready. They had each other, and they had the strength of the city behind them. They were no longer just the hunted and the protector. They were the guardians of the night, the ones who walked the line between light and dark, ensuring that the scales of justice remained balanced. The rain had stopped, leaving the city gleaming under the neon lights. The fog had lifted, revealing the true face of the streets, and as they set out into the night, Mr. Jenkins knew that the battle was never ending, but he also knew that they would fight it together. The confession note was a relic of the past, a symbol of the horror that had brought them together. But now it was the bond they shared, the understanding that in the face of evil, there was always a choice to stand and fight or to cower in the shadows. And they had chosen to stand, to be the light that others could follow. Their partnership grew into something more than just a professional alliance. They shared meals, stories, and even the occasional laugh, finding solace in the knowledge that they were not alone in their quest. And with each victory, with each life saved, the weight of their burdens grew lighter, the shadows less oppressive. The city was changing, and so were they, evolving into the heroes it needed. But the night was not without its surprises. As they approached a darkened alley, a figure emerged, shrouded in the mist. Mr. Jenkins tensed, the pipe at the ready, but the detective's hand on his arm stopped him. "It's okay," she murmured. "It's just a lost soul." A young woman, no more than a girl, really, stood before them, Her eyes wide and filled with terror, she clutched a tattered note, the same symbol from Castor's confession staring back at them. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Help me." The detective took the note, her eyes narrowing as she read the words. "We will," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice firm. "We'll get you out of here." The girl looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You can't," she said. "He's already chosen me." The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The detective's grip tightened on her gun, her eyes scanning the alley. "Who?" she demanded. "Who's chosen you?" The girl's voice grew distant, as if recounting a nightmare. "The puppeteer," she murmured. "He says I'm the perfect pawn." Mr. Jenkins felt the ground shift beneath him. The night had just gotten darker, the game more twisted. A new player had entered the stage, one who played by rules they had never encountered before. But he knew that fear would not win. With the detective at his side, he faced the girl and made a vow. "We'll find him," he said, his voice steady. "And we'll stop him." The girl looked at them, the first glimmer of trust in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, and with that, she slipped away into the night, leaving them with a new puzzle to unravel. The detective studied the note, her brow furrowed. "The puppeteer," she murmured. "This is unlike anything we've seen before." Mr. Jenkins nodded, his mind racing. "We need to find out who he is, what he wants." They returned to the station. The detectives' team was waiting for them, eager for updates. They gathered around the conference table, the air thick with anticipation. Mr. Jenkins laid out the new information, the room growing quiet as they digested the gravity of the situation. Days turned into weeks as they delved into the twisted mind of the puppeteer. They found a pattern in the disappearances, a macabre dance of control and chaos that seemed to have no end. The killer was always one step ahead, leaving no evidence behind. The city was on edge, the whispers of fear growing louder with each passing day. Mr. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that the puppeteer was watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, the echoes of the girl's words haunting him. "He's already chosen me." The thought of more lives at stake fueled his obsession, pushing him to the brink of his sanity. And then, one rainy afternoon, a breakthrough. A witness had come forward, someone who had seen the puppeteer with the girl the night she vanished. They had a description, a name, a place to start. The detective's eyes met Mr. Jenkins across the table, and they both knew that the hunt was on. The address led them to an abandoned theater, the marquee's lights flickering with a sinister glee. They approached with caution, their hearts pounding in sync with the rain. Inside, the scent of dust and decay mingled with something darker, something malevolent. The stage was set for a final act, the curtains drawn tightly, hiding the horrors that lay in wait. The detective signaled for Mr. Jenkins to stay back, her gun drawn. They moved through the shadows, their flashlights playing. Over the worn velvet seats, the echoes of long-forgotten applause, a haunting backdrop to their steps. The theater was a tomb, a place where the puppeteer had played out his twisted fantasies. And there, in the bowels of the building, they found her, the girl from the alley, her eyes vacant, strings attached to her limbs. The puppeteer had made good on his promise, turning her into a marionette in his sick game. Rage surged through Mr. Jenkins, his grip on the pipe white-knuckled. "We're too late," he murmured, his voice thick with despair. But the detective's gaze was fixed on something else. A clue, a thread left behind. "Look," she said, pointing at the floor. A single footprint, slightly askew, led away from the scene. "He's been here watching us," she said, her voice grim. "And now he knows we're onto him." The hunt intensified, the stakes higher than ever before. They followed the trail of the puppeteer through the city's underbelly, a twisted tapestry of deceit and pain. Each step brought them closer to the monster, each clue a taunt that only served to stoke the fire of their determination. The final act was set in motion, the detective and Mr. Jenkins moving with a single-minded purpose. They had become the city's guardians, the ones who dared to walk the line between good and evil. And as they faced the puppeteer in the dimly lit alleyways, the rain a silent witness to their battle, Mr. Jenkins knew that they had become more than just partners in crime fighting. They had become a symbol of hope, a beacon that shone through the darkest of nights. The puppeteer had underestimated them, had not foreseen the bond that had formed between them. The confrontation was brutal, a clash of wills that left them both bruised and blooded. Mr. Jenkins swung the pipe with a ferocity born of rage, each blow aimed at the puppeteer's mocking grin. The detective's gun was a constant companion, her shots precise and unerring. But the killer was a slippery foe, always one step out of reach. The alley became a stage for their battle, the rain a backdrop that mirrored the turmoil within. Puppeteer taunted them, his words a twisted symphony of madness. "You think you can save them all?" he jeered, his voice echoing through the night. "You're just two pawns in a game you don't understand." Mr. Jenkins' grip tightened, the metal pipe cold and slick in his hand. He knew the truth in those words, knew the futility of their quest. But he also knew that to stop, to give in, was to concede defeat. And so he swung again, his eyes never leaving the killers. The detective closed in, her movements a dance of precision and strength. She had seen too much, felt the weight of too many lost souls. This was her chance to balance the scales. The air was thick with the scent of wet concrete and the metallic tang of blood, the only sound, the harsh breaths of their struggle. And then it was over. The puppeteer lay on the ground, his strings of control severed, his twisted games brought to an end. The detective holstered her gun, her eyes on Mr. Jenkins. They had won this round, but the battle for the city's soul was far from over. In the aftermath, as the sirens grew louder and the flashing lights of the police cars pierced the darkness, Mr. Jenkins felt the weight of his choices. He had stepped into the fray, had embraced a role that was never meant for him. But as he looked into the eyes of the detective, he knew he had found his place. The city had shaped him, had taken the quiet baker and forged him into a warrior of light, and together they would continue to stand against the shadows, to protect the innocent, and to ensure that the puppeteer's reign of terror was never forgotten, but never repeated. The rain had stopped, the night once again still and quiet. The detective offered a hand, helping Mr. Jenkins to his feet. "We make a good team," she said, her voice a whisper of steel. He nodded, the exhaustion etched into his features. "We do," he agreed, and with that, they stepped out of the alley, the city's guardians, ready to face whatever the night had in store. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The case of the puppeteer was closed, but the legacy of his crimes lingered in the air. The city was a canvas of fear, and Mr. Jenkins and the detective were its artists working tirelessly to paint over the dark stains with the bright colors of hope and justice. They became a fixture in the media, their names whispered, with a mix of awe and gratitude, but the shadows never truly disappeared. The detective's eyes remained haunted by the ghosts of the past, and Mr. Jenkins found himself drawn back to the quiet solace of his apartment, the confines of the bakery, where the scent of yeast and sugar offered a temporary reprieve from the horrors they faced. One afternoon, as he kneaded dough with a furious rhythm, trying to banish the images from his mind, the detective knocked on his door. She held another note, the same symbol taunting them from its pages. "We have another one," she said. Her voice tight with tension. Mr. Jenkins set aside his work, his heart sinking. The cycle was starting anew, and he knew that they would be drawn back into the abyss, time and again, as long as there were monsters to hunt. But he also knew that he could not turn his back on the city that had become his battleground. Together, they studied the new confession, the words a chilling echo of Castor's. The killer called himself the Conductor, and his game was more intricate, more personal. He chose his victims not at random, but with a twisted sense of purpose, leaving behind a trail of lives shattered by his cruel orchestrations. The detective looked up from the note, her gaze meeting Mr. Jenkins's in the dim light of the kitchen. "We can't do this alone," she said. "We need help." And so, they built a team, a coalition of the lost and the found, those who had been touched by the darkness and those who refused to let it claim them. They were a motley crew of former victims, detectives and everyday heroes, united by their desire to protect what was left of their city's innocence. The Conductor's symphony grew more complex with each passing day. But Mr. Jenkins and the detective were no longer pawns to be played. They had become the maestros, leading their makeshift orchestra through the twisted melody of the killer's mind. The chase took them to the very edge of sanity and back, each step a dance with the devil himself. But with each victory, with each life saved, the bond between them grew stronger. They had become more than just a team. They were a family, forged in the fires of adversity. As they stood on the roof of the city's tallest building, the lights of the metropolis stretching out before them like a sea of stars, Mr. Jenkins knew that their work was far from over. Shadows would always hold more monsters, more nightmares, waiting to be brought to light. But he also knew that as long as he had the detective by his side and their band of misfits fighting at their backs, they could face whatever the darkness threw at them. The wind whispered through the streets below, carrying with it the promise of a new day. The rain had stopped, leaving the city gleaming with the potential of a fresh start. And in the quiet moments between battles, Mr. Jenkins allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future where fear did not rule the night. The detective's hand rested on his shoulder, her eyes scanning the horizon. "We'll get them all," she murmured. "One by one, we'll make them pay." Mr. Jenkins nodded, his grip tightening on the pipe. The Conductor was just the latest in a long line of monsters, but they had proven that even in the darkest of places, light could still be found. They knew that they were ready for whatever the night had in store. The hunt for the Conductor was a symphony of chaos, each movement bringing them closer to the truth. They followed, a trail of clues that wound through the city's most secret places, the echoes of the killer's madness guiding them deeper into the labyrinth of his twisted mind. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the streets slick with the promise of a new chapter in their endless battle. The final confrontation came in an abandoned subway station. the rumble of distant trains, a mournful backdrop to their final act. The conductor had set his stage with the precision of a master. His victims posed like mannequins in a macabre play. The detective's eyes scanned the shadows, her hand steady on her gun. Mr. Jenkins stepped forward, the pipe a silent declaration of war. The conductor emerged from the gloom, his smile a chilling crescendo. "You think you've won," he crooned, his voice a serpent's hiss. But the game has only just begun. The fight was brutal, a cacophony of steel and bone that echoed through the empty station. The detective's bullets sang their deadly aria, Mr. Jenkins' pipe a bass note of finality. And as the conductor fell, his strings of power severed, Mr. Jenkins felt the weight of his actions. He had become the very thing he had once feared, a creature of the night stalking the shadows. In the aftermath, the detective looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of admiration and concern. "You can't keep doing this," she said softly. "You're not built for this world." But Mr. Jenkins knew that he had been reborn in those alleyways, transformed by the very darkness he sought to banish. He was no longer just a baker, no longer just a man with a vendetta. He was a symbol of hope, a beacon that pierced the veil of fear. The city had claimed him, had made him its own. And as he stood in the quiet of the station, the only sound the distant wail of a train, he knew that he had found his purpose. Together, they walked into the night, the detective and the baker-turned-hero, their footsteps echoing through the streets. The rain had started again, a cleansing wash that whispered of new beginnings and the promise of a city that would never truly rest. But in that moment, as they disappeared into the mist, they were more than just hunters of the night. They were the guardians of the lost, the champions of the innocent. And in the hearts of those they had saved, they were the ones who had brought the music of fear to a silent close. The detective looked at Mr. Jenkins, her gaze searching. "You've changed," she said, her voice filled with a quiet understanding. He nodded, the weight of his new identity heavy on his shoulders. "We all have," he replied, "but it's who we are now that matters." The months that followed saw Mr. Jenkins slowly rebuilding the pieces of his old life. The bakery had become a place of refuge, a bastion of warmth and normalcy in a world gone mad. But the shadows of the night still called to him, whispering of the monsters that lurked just beyond the light. One evening, as he locked up the shop, he found a single white rose tucked into the doorframe, a chilling reminder of the conductor's final performance. The detective arrived, her expression grim. "We have another one," she said, her eyes reflecting the unspoken dread. A new killer had emerged, one who saw himself as a successor to the puppeteer and the conductor. His calling card was a black handkerchief, the symbol of his control over life and death. The detective handed Mr. Jenkins the note, the same symbol etched in the corner. "This one's for you," she said, her voice a mix of admiration and warning. Mr. Jenkins took the paper, his heart racing. He knew what this meant. The night had once again claimed him as its own, and there was no turning back. "We'll find him," he said, his voice a promise. The detective nodded, her eyes steely. "We will," she agreed, "together." And so, they stepped into the shadows once more, two souls bound by fate and a shared destiny. The hunt was on, and the city watched with bated breath, their silent prayers a soft refrain against the backdrop of the endless night. The chase was relentless, each clue a taunt that led them deeper into the abyss. The new killer, known only as the Maestro, was more elusive than his predecessors. His methods a symphony of pain and torment, but Mr. Jenkins had become a master of the game. His instincts honed by the very monsters he sought to destroy. The final confrontation came on a moonlit night, the air thick with the scent of rain. They found the Maestro in an old church, the pews stained with the tears of his victims. He was a tall figure, his eyes gleaming with the madness that had consumed him. "Welcome," he said, his voice a purr. "The show is about to begin." Mr. Jenkins stepped forward, the pipe in his hand a silent challenge. The detective's gun was at the ready, her eyes never leaving the killer's face. "It ends here," she said, her voice a promise. The battle was swift. A dance of light and shadow played out in the hallowed halls of the church. The Maestro's movements were fluid, each strike a testament to his twisted genius. But Mr. Jenkins had become a force of nature, driven by the need to save, to protect, to avenge. In the end, it was the pipe that brought the Maestro to his knees. The metal a stark contrast to the delicate strings he had once used to control his marionettes. The detective stepped forward, her gun aimed at the killer's head. "It's over," she said, her voice firm. Mr. Jenkins looked down at the man before him, the monster that had haunted his dreams. They walked out into the night. The church bells tolled a mournful tune. The city was still, the rain a gentle lullaby that whispered of peace. The night would always hold its secrets, its whispers of darkness waiting to be silenced. And so he continued his vigil, the baker by day, the hunter by night. The night will always call for vengeance. His eyes had seen too much. His hands had felt too much pain. But in the quiet moments, before the dawn, as the city slumbered, Mr. Jenkins found solace in the knowledge that he was not alone. The detective, his unlikely partner. But as the years passed, the weight of their battles began to show. The detective's eyes grew weary. The lines on Mr. Jenkins' face deepened. One night, as they sat in the detective's office, surrounded by cold coffee cups, she placed a hand on his. "We can't do this forever," she said gently. "We need to find someone to carry on the fight." Mr. Jenkins knew she was right. The night had claimed too much of him already. He thought of the quiet mornings in the bakery, the warmth of the ovens, the smell of bread rising. It felt like a lifetime ago. The detective nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "We'll teach them everything we know," she agreed. "We'll make sure the city never forgets the darkness, but always has a light to guide it home." And so, they began the search for an apprentice, someone who could one day take up the mantle and keep the night at bay. They found a young officer, fresh-faced and eager, whose eyes held the same fire that had once burned in theirs. They taught him the rhythms of the streets, the dance of shadows, the silent language of fear. As the young officer grew in skill and courage, Mr. Jenkins watched with a mix of pride and sadness. The night was relentless, its hunger insatiable, but he knew that soon he would be able to rest, that the city would be in good hands. The detective watched alongside him, her eyes reflecting the unspoken promise they had made to each other. The night was long, the battles many, but Mr. Jenkins knew that every dawn brought them closer to the end. The day would come when they could lay down their weapons and step away from the edge of the abyss. But until then, they would stand firm, the guardians of the lost, the champions of the innocent. their hearts beating in time with the pulse of the city they had sworn to protect. The young officer grew swiftly under their tutelage, his eyes now mirrors of the grim determination that had once been Mr. Jenkins alone. The detective watched him with a proud smile, knowing that he would be the one to carry on their legacy. "Remember," she whispered to him one night, "it's not about the fight, but the lives you save." The hunt for the next moniker grew more intense with each passing moon. The shadow puppeteer had surfaced, a twisted soul who played with the strings of human emotion like a sadistic marionette show. His victims were left with no voice, no choice, only the silent screams echoing through the night. As they approached the final act, Mr. Jenkins felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. Each swing of the pipe, each footstep in the shadows, brought him closer to the realization that his time as a vigilante was drawing to a close. The detective noticed the change in him, the quiet moments of reflection that had grown longer, the fire in his eyes dimming slightly. The confrontation with the shadow puppeteer was a crescendo of chaos, a battle of wills that tested them all. The old church where they had faced the maestro now served as the stage for their final performance. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the stained glass windows casting a kaleidoscope of colors on the blood-soaked floor. Mr. Jenkins and the detective moved in tandem, a well-rehearsed ballet of justice. The young officer followed closely, his eyes wide with the horror and the awe of the dance of life and death. The puppeteer's reign of terror was brought to an end with a final brutal strike of the pipe. As the echoes of the fight faded, Mr. Jenkins looked into the detective's eyes, and she knew it was time. He handed her the pipe, a symbol of the battles they had fought, the lives they had saved. "You're ready," he said, his voice hoarse. "You and him, you'll keep the night at bay." The detective took the pipe, her grip firm, her eyes never leaving his. "Thank you," she murmured, "for everything." And with that, Mr. Jenkins disappeared into the night, the shadows swallowing him whole. The detective watched him go, her heart heavy with the weight of his sacrifice. But she knew that his spirit would live on in the heart of the city, in the whispers of the night, and in the footsteps of those who continued the fight. The young officer looked to her. The torch passed. "What now?" he asked, his voice trembling. The detective took a deep breath, the weight of their shared destiny settling upon her. "Now," she said, "we make sure the night never wins." The young officer grew more distant, his grip on the pipe a silent declaration of his own struggle. He had lost his mentor, his beacon in the dark, and now he faced a future where the line between good and evil was blurred beyond recognition. The weight of the pipe grew heavier with each step, a constant reminder of the burden they now shared. The detective found solace in her work. The cases they solved a balm to her tortured soul. But there were moments when the rain fell softly on the pavement and the neon lights cast a melancholic glow, that she would pause and remember the man who had started it all. His kind eyes, his gentle touch, the warmth of his bakery on cold mornings. The laughter that had once filled her days had been replaced by the cold embrace of the night. Mr. Jenkins' memory haunted them, a spectre that whispered in the shadows, a reminder of the price of their crusade. His laughter had turned to a mournful sigh in their ears, his smile a grimace of pain. The man they had once looked up to had been consumed by the very evil he had fought, leaving them to navigate a world where heroes fell and monsters rose.